Okay, it's been a while since I've made a video. I started this channel kind of with the thoughts that I would just talk about whatever I wanted and do minimal prep, but my mind doesn't quite work that way and don't want to put out something that doesn't have at least some preparation for it. But there's been something that came in the news here in Canada just a couple of days ago, and that was the news coming from my home province that they have signed a new agreement with the government of Quebec, and I am speaking about the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, along with input from the federal government to further develop Churchill Falls, Churchill River projects within Labrador. Most notably, it adds a new cost sharing and revenue sharing agreements between Quebec for the existing hydroelectric projects, as well as some policies directing them to allow sale to the United States, as well as some agreements on further development, such as wind in Labrador, although concrete details for a lot of these things have been left out. Most notably, this is coming to replace an MOU from the previous governments of Newfoundland and Quebec that is honestly very similar to this term. It's been somewhat controversial because there's a long history in Newfoundland of grievance over the first Churchill Falls deal signed in the 1960s that really seems to have undervalued Churchill Falls and Newfoundland's ownership over the electricity produced there. So many people are hailing this new agreement, though, as a step in the right direction and as something that's going to make a lot of economic sense for Newfoundland and the country going forward. In fact, this is making world news as the largest clean energy investment in North American history due to the costs of the expansion of Labrador development projects, as well as the investment of $10 billion from the federal government. So a lot of this might seem good. On first blush, if you're an environmentalist who's really concerned about the burning of fossil fuels and the government's kind of cashing in on all of that, it seems, constructing new pipelines throughout the country, working with oil execs to see what kind of development can be done offshore and within the interior. So making a step towards renewable energy, a huge investment, it seems like the step in the right direction, where we can finally start to transition away from fossil fuels and put more attention on to renewable energy. And they're saying that these projects, the current Churchill Falls hydroelectric projects, new hydroelectric projects, most notably in Gull Island, as well as these wind developments, they'll be able to provide enough power to supply all households in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Now, this power won't be powering those households, most notably, because it's not largely going to Ontario. It seems like they're aiming to trade mostly with the United States, the eastern states of the United States, as well as some of the other Atlantic provinces and the own provinces of Quebec and Newfoundland. But anyone from Newfoundland should know that these projects within Labrador are fraught, and not just because Joey Smallwood signed a bad deal back in the 1960s. Most notably, in recent decades, we've seen the development of Muskrat Falls, described most infamously as a boondoggle. It is seen as wasting billions of dollars of government money, having major cost overruns, controversial decisions within public crown corporations, and major inquiries that ended the political career of many people throughout the province, to be honest. Most notably, Premier at the time, Kathy Dunderdale, which most of the blame of this project fell on after Danny Williams had resigned. But what most Newfoundlanders haven't really internalized about Muskrat Falls is that it wasn't just some corrupt government bureaucrat at the top making bad decisions. It wasn't just a lack of listening to industry professionals. And it wasn't just some kind of cronyism within the province. The problem with Muskrat Falls is fundamental to how governments have been doing these kinds of development projects in the last 40 years. And this is through contracting with private developers, private contractors, and private engineers to complete all of these projects. You might question, like, how would we even do these without contracting out? I mean, the government doesn't have this expertise. Do you want the government to just build these projects without knowing what they're doing? My answer to that is obviously no. But it's not one or the other. There was a point in time where the government didn't necessarily have contractors that they could just endlessly go to and endlessly shovel funds into to get the things that they need to done. In fact, this is a relatively recent phenomenon within the last at least half century, where there's been more of an effort towards privatization. There's been more of an effort to cut down on the things that governments themselves are funding and doing. And there's been an effort for government to work with and support private industry beyond doing things that they just see as being in the public good. This is a fundamental core tenet of neoliberalism. And I want to kind of go down this rabbit hole with Muskrat Falls to show how Muskrat Falls itself is a product of these kinds of relationships between government and private business, and how that relationship creates perverse incentives for the private businesses. And when you have people in government who are sympathetic to these businesses, who have come up through these industries, it is a very corrupt, incestuous system that leads public money from taxpayers like you and me, to be funneled towards already rich developers who do not need the money. And in addition, these projects are presented in the good of all people, but ultimately the people that they are enriching are the people at the top of these companies, and they are costing us plenty of money. So while I do support hydroelectric projects in concept, and I do think it is necessary for us to transition to renewable energy, we still need to do so with an eye towards colonialism and an eye towards capitalism, and to look at each project, its construction, its development plan, and how power operates in the decisions that are being made. We need to look at each project in its own distinctiveness and to understand it on its own level in how it relates to these social systems. Just wanted to jump here and note that all of my sources are in the description. A large part of my information here is derived from the Muskrat Falls inquiry that the government of Newfoundland had commissioned that came out around 2016 and 2017, along with a few articles from the Independent NL and from the CBC. As I just said, they'll all be in the description. I apologize for not directly citing them within the video. I was looking at some notes and neglected to think about that. So everything is in the description. Back to your video. So the Muskrat Falls project was officially greenlit in 2013, but the wheels began to spin on this project in the early 2000s after Danny Williams became premier under a progressive conservative government. He started to make some changes at Nalcor, which is Newfoundland's public crown corporation in charge of energy production, which started in, the changes started in 2003 when he put Gilbert Bennett in charge of the Lower Churchill project, which would become the Muskrat Falls project. And Gilbert Bennett previously worked at Rogers Cable, which is very interesting because Danny Williams, he is a billionaire, he is a very wealthy bourgeois man, and he made his wealth through telecommunications within the province, and very famously sold off his business to Rogers prior to becoming premier. So already looking a little bit sleazy where he is appointing someone from the company that bought his company to a leadership role within Nalcor. 2 years later, he appoints Ed Martin to become CEO of Nalcor. And Ed Martin had previously worked in the oil and gas industry and within finance. So these are not people who are skilled in public policy. These are not people that come from specific renewable energy development. These are not people that come from an environmental lens. These are not even necessarily people that come from like a national development angle. These are staunch industry people who are running this project. There are several problems with that. One is industry people have connections to other industry people. There's going to be conflicts of interest when these men are rubbing shoulders together every Friday and Saturday night, when they get together for socials, when they work together on projects previously, when they built a rapport and trust with existing communities that they've already been running with. And most importantly, they are high on their own supply. They think that they know best by virtue of being business people, by virtue of being in the industries that they are in. They think that their knowledge, their experience, their ability, and their power trumps everything else. So the decisions that they are made are catered towards the market. They're catered towards a free market analysis. They're not catered towards actually spending money on social development. They're not catered towards providing good outcomes for the public. They're catered towards maximum resource extraction, maximum wealth extraction, and maximum wealth going to the people at the top. So these early warning signs could really show us the direction that Danny Williams was taking Nalcor and taking energy development within Newfoundland and Labrador. In the context prior to this project really coming to fruition, as I had alluded to before, there was a very fraught history with hydroelectric development within Newfoundland and Labrador. In the mid-20th century, there was a major project on the upper Churchill River, which is called the Churchill Falls Hydroelectric Dam. And at the time, the government, which was one of the first governments of a provincial Newfoundland under Premier Joey Smallwood, signed a deal with the Quebec government that fixed the rates of electricity that the Quebec government would be paying. And basically, Newfoundland lost out on a major cut of energy as energy prices would skyrocket in the decades to follow the project. Really, it was a lack of foresight from the governments to see that energy costs were going to skyrocket so much and that they shouldn't have had a deal that had this fixed energy rate. And in a lot of ways, the last 60 years of political development within Newfoundland has been centered around grievance on this project and how to redress the original sin, so to say, of Newfoundland provincehood. And so when Danny Williams comes into power, he comes in on the back of this kind of raw Newfoundland nationalism, this kind of revolt against Confederation. Not necessarily that we want to leave Confederation, but that the federal government does not value Newfoundland enough. They don't prioritize Newfoundland issues enough. They don't prioritize Newfoundland economic development enough, and that we need a strong provincial government that's going to fight the federal government, that's going to advocate for Newfoundland provincially, and is going to pursue policies that are in the best interest of Newfoundland and Labrador and not Canada or not anyone else outside of the province. And a big symbol for that is obviously this Churchill Falls project. So one thing that Danny Williams has his eye on kind of from the beginning is some renewed national development project to correct, again, the sin of the original Churchill Falls project. So by 2013, the wheels are really moving on this, and this is presented as a nationalist project, and moreover, it's presented as a very smart economic project for the province that's going to provide clean, renewable energy for the foreseeable future that we can sell to Quebec, we can sell to the other Atlantic provinces, we could sell to the United States, make a load of money like we didn't with the other Churchill Falls project, and correct the wrongs in the past. And this could really be supported off the back of the oil boom that happens in the 2000s. So major investments happen within the oil sector in Newfoundland from the late 1980s through to the early 2000s, and rapid expansion within the 2000s as well. But in the 2000s, you really see a spike in the price of a barrel of oil, especially for Newfoundland, and this provides big budget surpluses. This provides a lot of money within the province, a lot of a new kind of bourgeois class emerging that has more wealth than previous generations. And Danny Williams really thinks that he can build this nationalistic project with some of those funds, and that we now have the economic capacity to take something on at the scale of a Muskrat Falls. From the beginning, signs weren't great, though. So prior to Nalcor's annual general meeting in 2013, rumors started to circulate that the cost estimates provided in the initial conception were inaccurate, and that offers that were coming in to help build this project were way over budget. Ed Martin assured everyone at that meeting that the cost estimates were accurate and that there weren't going to be major cost overruns, that this project was going to go forward as planned. He knew, and possibly some others at Nalcor knew at the time, that this was not true. SNC-Lavalin had been working with Nalcor after this project was greenlit to do a report on the potential costs and issues that they might run into with this project, and then remained in a kind of engineering support role for the remainder of the project. Within that report, which was given to Nalcor prior to the annual general meeting, it warned that there could be major cost overruns and potential risks that would cause the project to be delayed and cost even more money. And they said at the time that there was about $2.4 billion of quote-unquote risk exposure for the project. So already prior to any ground being dug, prior to anything being concretely done outside of plans being made and deals signed, we see that Nalcor is facing an almost $2.5 billion cost overrun on the project. There were two other major actors that I want to talk about that I think are key to understanding the pitfalls of these kind of projects, and that is EMRA, which is the private energy company of Nova Scotia, and the other is a contractor named Astaldi, which was tasked with building much of the infrastructure for the Muskrat Falls project. So a deal was signed with EMRA, basically to provide a bunch of upfront capital for the project to help ensure that the costs for the government and Nalcor were kept to a somewhat minimum, and it allowed Nova Scotia to then take a certain portion, 20% of the output from Muskrat Falls, and use that for their own sale. In addition to this deal, EMRA was tasked with building a maritime link between Labrador and the transmission lines there to Nova Scotia to get the energy from Muskrat Falls into Nova Scotia. Astaldi is a little bit more straightforward, where it's exactly as you think. They were tasked with building the actual dam itself, and they were there from beginning to end throughout that process. There were other contractors who were tasked with building other elements of the project, such as transmission lines and other infrastructure that was required to actually move the energy from the dam to other places. But in my estimation, they're somewhat smaller elements of this story, and they can be scrutinized in more detail maybe at another point in time, but I think that they follow a similar pattern to these things that I'm talking about right here. So first I want to think about EMRA and what signing that deal with them implies about the project and where it was going to go and how viable it actually was. So in all honesty, EMRA hasn't had too much of an impact on the project outside of putting pressure on Nalcor to get the deliverables from their side into the deal. As of a few years ago, Nova Scotia still hadn't seen power from Muskrat Falls. I believe in 2021 or 2022, they started to receive some of that power. But what it more largely says about the project is that the government actually couldn't fund it themselves, that it wasn't actually economically viable without a partnership with a big corporation like this that had some capital that they could throw around. It also ties them now to the direct designs of the leadership at EMRA. EMRA obviously wants to extract as much profit out of the energy that they're selling as possible. That is their task as a private business. That is the market logic. And while, yes, the idea is Newfoundland is selling it to them so that Newfoundland can profit, really it's adding just a middleman in the middle between Nova Scotia consumers and energy producers within Newfoundland. And it's this kind of corporate corruption that is allowing people to profit off of a public utility like that was a sign from the very beginning that this project was not necessarily in the public interest, but it was inherently this capitalistic project. It was managed and created by the bourgeois, by local business elites, by industry elites within the oil and gas and energy sectors, and that this was really a big ploy to spread the money around in their class. And so while EMRA hasn't had too much of a negative effect on the project, the fact that they needed to be on board in the first place, that this was an aspect of the Muskrat Falls project, I think it really shows that this wasn't in the interest of the public good of Newfoundland people, but it was a direct attempt at kind of like a corporate expansion. And off the backs of taxpayer dollars and through a public corporation in Nalcor. I think the other more suspect element of the Muskrat Falls project is this contractor, Astaldi. In 2015, at Nalcor's AGM, there were questions raised about this contract. And at the time, the discussion was about whether this was a fixed-rate contract, meaning is the contract with Astaldi tied to the actual amount of work done? And the metric that they used for this was the amount of concrete poured. At that time, Ed Martin, again, assured Nalcor that the contract that Nalcor had with Astaldi was a fixed-rate contract. And the amount of money that Astaldi was going to receive was directly tied to the amount of work that they did. When the inquiry came out in 2016, it was revealed that this was not the case. So Astaldi is an Italian contracting company, and it was chosen because of its low bid in comparison to other North American offers, and because of its high, quote-unquote, technical scoring. But there were issues almost right away. So there were questions as to why an Italian company was chosen that had little experience in these kind of projects and had little experience in kind of the cold weather climates that they would be building in. And at the time, the justification was, again, in the cost and in this idea that they had proven that they were capable of doing that. And Nalcor made an agreement with the contractor that they would contract based on this, what is known as an LMAX model. So the idea behind this was that they, instead of being paid a lump sum for the project right off the bat, they would be paid based on hours worked at a cap. So they didn't get paid for work, supposedly, that would not be done, and that the cost would be capped at a certain level. Right away, there were issues with the project. There were delays in excavation, delays in building. There was a work stoppage at a certain point a few years in because of disputes between Astaldi and Nalcor. Reports were that that Astaldi, was viewed as a joke. They were seen as incompetent, not knowing what they were doing. The LMAX agreement eventually had to be increased to just get the work done. And by the time that Muskrat Falls was built, the relationship between Nalcor and Astaldi was very sour. There had been major cost overruns on this side, and the inquiry suggests that about 31% of the cost overrun within the Muskrat Falls project comes from this one contract. And it is by far the single largest element that has provoked these cost overruns within Muskrat Falls. So some of these things are, physical material limits, issues that have to do with land, geography, excavation, technical things that were overlooked. The SNC Lavalin report ignored. But at the end of the day, so much of this kind of thing happens with these projects because if nothing does go wrong, then it's coming in under budget. It looks all good. The appearance to the public seems that everything went as planned. And now you have a product that you paid an expected amount for that you're now receiving. But this doesn't fundamentally get at the issue with this model. It is a capitalistic model of development, meaning this project was looked at as a source of profit before anything else. Profit, not power. This was not power for Newfoundland people. This was profit for maybe the Newfoundland government, maybe Nalcor, certainly for these private businesses that were on board with this project, such as Emra and Astaldi. And you can see that with this kind of this lowest bid government contract. And now this is standard practice across a lot of governments, that teams are mandated to take the lowest bid, depending on if they are actually fulfilling the goals set out by the plan. But the major issue with this is, obviously, you are forsaking some of quality for a cheaper bill, but it's also at the very outset looking at these projects as a kind of capitalistic investment, something that we need to keep the costs down on to maximize our profits, rather than seeing it as something that we need to do to develop our country, to develop our people, to ensure access to cheap electricity, guaranteed electricity beyond anything. Instead of looking at all of those things, it's looked at as a profit-first perspective, that we need to keep costs down to ensure that we can sell this power at a profitable rate. And the second overarching problem is the concept of government partnering with these large international corporations to build anything or do anything within the first place. Now, from our perspective, that seems absolutely crazy. Why would the government not partner with contractors? Why would they not engage with private businesses to do the work that they're already doing? The government doesn't know how to build a dam. The government doesn't know how to develop infrastructure projects to build it on their own. So they have to contract out. It's just obvious, right? Well, I don't think it's that obvious. And I think that we have a long history of governments creating either crown corporations or internal departments and legionaries to basically go out and do this engineering work themselves, do this construction work themselves. It is not unprecedented for the government to handle these things in-house and to ensure that the marketplace, that private businesses do not have a bearing on these projects and these deals. Why would that be important? Well, because private businesses, as I've been saying this whole time, have a perverse incentive when they come into these deals. And this is exactly what happened, speculating, with Astaldi here. At least looking at the interests of Astaldi against Nalcor and the government, we can see that Astaldi has a vested interest in squeezing out as much as they can from this contract. So if they can delay, take as much time as possible to do what they need to do, they can appeal to Nalcor and appeal to the government, hey, the project's not done. We need more time. We need more money. We need more investment put into us so we can give you the deliverables that we set out for in the original contract, even though we are not respecting the cost estimates that we put down within that contract. And that is the problem inherent with kind of the LMAX model too, is that sure, it makes sure in certain instances that you're not getting paid for work that's not done, but they can also, when the cap approaches, go to Nalcor and say, hey, the cap is approaching and it's not done, either increase the cap or have an incomplete project. And this is the kind of catch-22 that the government and Nalcor found themselves in years deep into the development of Muskrat Falls, where there wasn't really much that you could do at that point. I mean, do you not finish the project? Do you try to hire another contractor to come in and figure everything out? I mean, the cost of doing any of that would have been more than extending the LMAX and giving them more of a cap and paying them more. But this basically creates an extortion relationship between a private business and the government. And this kind of partnership is key to all kinds of government development. And it's why, since the 1980s, we've seen major public projects fall in despair of debt, of delays, and of a lack of good for the public. And we need to really reckon with that. We need to reckon that the problem was not within Muskrat Falls alone. The problem is within this model of development. Our problem is allowing these people who are high up in industry, who have high connections, and who think of themselves and their social position as superior than those who are not owners of large industries and corporations. It's a result of people with that ideology getting in and making decisions on billions and billions of public funds. From the very beginning, Muskrat Falls was also plagued with another major issue, and that was resistance from Indigenous people. The Innu Nation saw what was coming for them and their way of life when the government started to look around into Lower Churchill development. And in 2011, several Innu Nation community groups and representative organizations came together to establish the Joint Review Panel to discuss what impacts the development of the Lower Churchill would have on them. And they concluded, quote, "The project would have several significant adverse environmental effects on the aquatic and terrestrial environments, cultural and heritage, and should consumption advisories be required in Lake Melville on land and resource uses." So they saw that the development of Muskrat Falls would directly lead to them not being able to do traditional harvesting, support their way of life, and provide sustenance for themselves. And they were demanding that the government compensate them fairly or do something to address these issues. But the government continued to rebuff it. Nalcor denied that these environmental concerns were even an issue. They railroaded over Indigenous rights, and they had this thing developed. Now, eventually, there was some collaboration with the Innu Nation. Innu construction companies were involved with some of the development of the project, but all in all, this was a really rocky relationship. Several years into the project development, the Innu Nation was proven correct, and there was a major methyl mercury poisoning that happened in Lake Melville. This was downstream from Muskrat Falls and led to their fish having unsafe levels of methyl mercury that they could no longer eat the fish. This was responded to by several Newfoundland politicians. One notably at the time was federal Liberal Member of Parliament Nick Whalen, who said maybe they should just stop eating the fish. That is a paraphrase. But that was the attitude towards Newfoundland representatives and politicians, towards Indigenous people, raising concerns that this project was dismantling their way of life. It's too late for Muskrat Falls. It's there now. We can't take away what we've done. But since the development of Muskrat Falls, Indigenous groups, activists, the Innu Nation have been opposed to further development of the Churchill River, especially Gull Island, which has been on the minds of Newfoundland politicians ever since the Muskrat Falls project went under. Still, we're chasing our white whale in hydroelectric energy production. But in that path, we sacrifice everything. We sacrifice our own environment. We sacrifice our own people. We sacrifice Indigenous people. We sacrifice food, water, land, and time and energy in talking about all of this, in reporting on all of this. In 2021, the federal government and the provincial government announced that they had signed a huge deal of a relief package basically meant to address the financial pitfalls that occurred from the Muskrat Falls development project. And this promised a bailout package up to a value of $5.2 billion, some in direct aid and some in loans from the federal government. But the Innu Nation was completely cut out of this. They did not even get them involved on the ground, even though this project was built on unceded Innu nation, land. This entire process has cut out or cut around or undercut Indigenous people in what is a major project that has affected them almost more than anyone else, that has destroyed their waters, has destroyed their food sources, and has fundamentally changed their way of life forever. And even years later, almost a decade after the project's inception, the federal and provincial governments can't even so much as involve them in discussing what an aid package might look like to remediate some of the negative circumstances that came about because of this development. So now we come to today, where the federal government is proposing this biggest investment in clean energy in North American history. But we need to be cautious. We need to understand that these projects, when they're not properly managed, when they have no oversight, when they involve rapacious private companies, when they railroad over Indigenous rights, and when they have little to no concern about the environment, they produce negative outcomes for the province, for the country, and for the world in general. These projects need to be taken with great care and caution, and that does not mean that we don't turn towards green energy. It just means that we need to do so not just to do it, but with an eye towards sustainability, towards decolonization, towards power to the people. And we need to start doing these projects for the good of society and for social development instead of for the profits of some shareholders and private companies.